Hi, everyone. Okay, I am coming on to share some really important information with whoever is willing and able to listen about yoga and mental health. So, specifically, what I'm going to be talking about today is yoga and trauma. But I want to start first by defining trauma because it's going to help us understand the relationship between trauma and mental health. And once we get a little bit further into how yoga can be helpful in resolving trauma, it's going to bring it all together as far as the one of the many ways in which yoga is very instrumental in improving mental health and maintaining mental health. So this is a huge topic. You're probably hearing a lot of that buzzword trauma now throughout the world and the internet and everywhere in conversation. So very much like the term or phrase self-care, that word, you're going to start hearing it a lot. And every time that happens, this is the same reason why I stress defining the phrase of self-care, because that is something that I focus on my podcast. Self-care is my job in all of my content that I like to talk about as far as improving, your wellness overall. I've had to define self-care so many times because it is a buzzword that gets thrown around and suddenly it's put into context that might confuse the actual definition. And so now trauma is sort of in that same basket of terms that I think we really need to define. So let's start there. And you'll have to forgive me because I did make notes and I'm going to be hopping around, checking myself on what I'd like to cover, considering I want to keep this as concise as possible. We really could go so deep into so many of these, the intricacies of this topic, but we need to keep this top line. Otherwise, we'll be here for about 3 days. So here's trauma: deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So I'm going to stop there because if you look it up in the dictionary, it's going to give you that basic definition: deeply distressing or just a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And so immediately the brain would go to severely traumatic experiences such as a natural disaster, a major car accident, some kind of physical trauma, right? Like actual physical trauma where there's wound care following, things like that. So I'm going to share my screen for a second because I came across a few things that were really helpful and instrumental to further define. So this is just furthering that dictionary definition. Trauma is the response to, very, very important, the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self, and their ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. So this takes that definition a little bit deeper, which is useful because it broadens the spectrum of that term, not only in the physical sense, but in the behavioral, emotional, and mental sense. So we, taking into account something that we all know already, right? The fact that whether this traumatic event is a physical experience or some kind of ongoing chronic stress related to some type of mental abuse, just as an example, right? In either category, there is emotional response to that. So this definition takes into account the fact that trauma is the response, not just the actual occurring event. And we're going to get more into this, but the concept, emphasizing the concept that a traumatic event is different than when we say the word trauma, and taking that further, that whatever the event or prolonged ordeal is, when we talk about trauma, we are talking about the response and the prolonged symptoms that are involved. So I'm going to hopefully take this just a step further. I really thought this definition from the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices was extremely helpful. So if you come down about halfway through this page, behavioral health professionals. So above that, it's talking about physical trauma. Here we have behavioral health professionals more broadly define trauma as resulting from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that's from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So I found that to be really helpful, taking it even a step further in defining trauma. The fact that taking into account that not only is it one event, but it could be a series of events or a set of circumstances that have lasting adverse effects, not only physically, but mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually. And it's really important to take all of that. I know I'm going a little bit deep into this, but it's important to take this stuff into consideration because of the mental health epidemic that is upon us. Even if you take out whatever stressors have enhanced this epidemic based on the pandemic and pandemic, all these things that are happening in our world today. Even if you take that piece out and all of the stress and mental concerns that come with this pandemic experience that we're in, mental health is a major concern to a level that most people are starting to understand. But just to put it into context, the reason that we're talking about it in regards to yoga is that I don't want to say you never know who you're in a room with as far as like who you're practicing with or who you're teaching. But the concept is really important to grasp that most likely, if you are in some kind of a public space, you are surrounded by a high rate of people who are suffering or struggling with some kind of mental illness, disorder, etc. I think it's something like 1 in 3 people are diagnosed with some kind of mental illness. So it's really important to understand the gravity and the elevated concern here. And that's why we're sticking with this topic. So I'm going to take it a little bit further into the trauma as far as categorizing. So if you kind of, again, stick to like the textbook definitions, we have 3 forms of trauma. Acute, which is based on a singular event. So a natural disaster, a major car accident, something along those lines. We have chronic trauma based on repeated, prolonged experiences. So that could include things like domestic violence or abuse, or even chronic mental abuse within a relationship over time. And the other one that I really wanted to mention as far as chronic trauma in this category, because it really relates very deeply into how we sort of generate a more trauma-informed world and why it's important, is community violence. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that there are special populations, there are disenfranchised and marginalized and underserved communities in this world that experience community violence chronically every single day. So I'm pointing that out because imagine what that does to a person's inner world if they are constantly and chronically bombarded by violence or other. So I want, that was just a good way to kind of bring your head around the concept of chronic and prolonged repeated trauma. Another category of trauma is complex trauma. So this is varied, multiple traumatic events, often invasive and within interpersonal nature. Okay. So this could be things like abuse, right? Within a family. Complex, I think is, they use that category as a little bit more overarching for like everything else, because everything else gets very complex. And there's, intricacies of everyone's individual situation that are very hard to take into account unless it's case by case. And then I wanted to add some other, not necessarily categories, but bring your awareness to some other areas where trauma lives in our lives. We have generational trauma. So we have things that, for example, happen to our grandparents, and traumatic experiences that happen to our grandparents and our great grandparents and further back, that send patterns, lifestyle patterns, and even day-to-day patterns of living through an entire family line that will eventually, for one reason or another, land within our lifestyle and within our being. And now we're living out these belief systems and concerns and fears and anxieties about things that didn't actually happen to us, but happened to our ancestors, to our family line within our lineage. So we really have to take that into account too. You have developmental trauma, things that occur within your development, whether that is from in utero. There could be traumas that occur in a mother's life surrounding, the mother, that actually affects the child within the womb. There could be a traumatic birth event, and there could also be abuse and traumatic events happening during a person's developmental years that really can, I don't want to say solidify, but can induce some very core wounds that, when we talk about core wounds, it's like that is those lasting effects. That is that response that's continuing to live out within you. And then there's psychological trauma, just sort of making sure that we bring that point in, that this isn't, sort of just this physical conversation. We're talking about psychological effects. Okay. So moving on. What happens when we experience trauma? What are the actual symptoms within a person's life that come up based on having experienced some form of trauma? Now, obviously, as you can imagine, this list can be days and days long because it depends very much on many things. It depends on what type of trauma. It depends on for how long that experience lasted. And it also just simply depends on the person and their ability to cope, right? And I think that that's a really very important point when we talk about trauma, because it absolutely will not only affect a person's ability to cope, but those lasting effects will be either reduced or elevated based on their ability to cope. Their ability to cope comes from our upbringing, right? Comes from what we learn about coping with stress. So how does it manifest in our lives, right? So you have, based on an actual, traumatic event, a response to an acute trauma, for example, could be PTSD, could be living with post-traumatic stress syndrome, or post-traumatic stress disorder is what PTSD stands for. I have this really amazing teacher that I follow. Her name is Ashley Turner, and she talks a lot about this diagnosis that is so prevalent, PTSD, because it is a disorder, just like so many other diagnoses, mental health diagnosis. You have that term of disorder included here. But the reality is that, and this is what she talks about, that the disorder isn't within the person. So that's where we can get into a much deeper conversation about what diagnosis, are in relation to trauma. But if a person is diagnosed with a disorder, they kind of embody that as that's who they are. They categorize themselves as somehow being off or wrong because they have a disorder. But the reality, and this is what this teacher talks about, is that the disorder was the actual traumatic event that happened. The disorder was a disordered way of living, a disorder to their life that translated as a symptom to post-traumatic stress. So the disorder is like, we're taking that out and we're placing it where it actually belongs. So I like to just offer that. Other symptoms, just general hopelessness. And there's a reason, which we're going to get into, why these type of symptoms arise. Depression, anxiety, numbing, emotional overwhelm, irritability, dissociation, which basically means that dissociation is disconnecting or uncoupling from your true essence, from yourself. So the reason why this might happen from, say, for example, chronic stress or chronic trauma, or even through developmental trauma, is that a person will have to, a child or an adult will have to put parts of themselves away or change or morph in some way in order to stay safe. So think about an abusive situation within a family dynamic where maybe there's addiction in the home, and speaking about certain topics is very triggering for the people involved. And so a person isn't able to speak their truth, and a person isn't able to really embody their full self. So they have to change parts of themselves in order to feel safe and accepted within the circle that they have been given as their family or as their group. So that dissociation is really, really important to note because it's really common. So we can go down the list. There is an extensive list of symptoms of trauma. Then those symptoms spiral into diagnosis, or we can call it disease or dis-ease. So I remember when I first heard this sort of concept within the yoga community, and even within my trainings, the fact that when we say disease or illness, we're actually talking about dis-ease, like a disruption in the ease, or a disruption in stasis, in how our bodies and our minds are supposed to operate and how they can operate in a healthy way. But we have events and responses and continued reaction that disrupts the ability of our body and our mind to cope and to regulate. So you have dis-ease. So we translate that, into other areas, into the medical world, and et cetera. You have dis-ease, you have illness, which translates to diagnosis. Now, I'm not here to debate about, if you have a mental illness diagnosis, like throw it out the window. Absolutely freaking not. There is absolutely, I would never begin to discuss whether or not a diagnosis is necessary. Diagnoses are necessary. However, there are a lot of diagnoses that we stumble upon these days that are very overarching. And there's been a lot of scientific research to back that diagnosis, such as chronic pain or fibromyalgia, autoimmune, specific mental diagnosis like just anxiety and depression, are in fact dis-ease from trauma. And you also have, of course, another major either symptom or outcome of trauma is also addiction. Because when a person loses their ability to cope based on these experiences, and it doesn't of course, like, we don't know when it's happening to us. We don't know, oh, I have lost my ability to cope, so I have to go find new healthy coping mechanisms. Many people who are struggling from addiction are just looking for an ability to cope with the pain that they're feeling, with the prolonged reaction from trauma. And they rely on either alcohol, drugs, food, etc., to numb and to soothe that pain that they're feeling. So addiction obviously is another major epidemic in this world. So we can't forget to mention it. And again, we can go so much further into all of these that it's crazy, but we have to, I'm trying to provide sort of like a top line experience here. We're going to move on. So what happens? So we talked about how it actually comes out in our lives as far as symptoms, but what actually happens physiologically? Yeah, I think that's right. From trauma. So when I say the term like physiology or physiologically, I just mean bodily function. Like, how exactly is this manifesting within our bodies and in our systems within our bodies? So I thought this was really helpful, and you can all like yell at me if you think that this is way too much. But I'm going to come back and share my screen for a moment. I would like to show you, I'd like to introduce the nervous system. I'm a Virgo, and org charts like really excite me, because organization really excites me. So I went and found an org chart of our nervous system. So as you can see, you have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. What I love about this is that we can see here the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So you have the brain, the spinal cord connects the brain and the peripheral nervous system. So if the spinal cord, which stems obviously from the top of this, the base of the neck, top of the spine, all the way down through our gut, right, through our belly, our second brain, then the peripheral nervous system is that lower region. So I want to just draw that to your attention. Peripheral nervous system is where we're focused in this conversation. And it is your like second brain, like your gut, right? And within the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system, which is responsible mostly for our movement. So it is in response to outside of our body's sensory information that will come inward and will tell the systems within our body to act or move in reaction to that. And the autonomic nervous system is where we're really focused on in this conversation, because this controls involuntary body functions. So things that happen automatically to regulate us and to maintain stasis. Within the autonomic nervous system, you have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is, again, in reaction to experiences. That is the flight, fight, or freeze response, sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is the rest and digest, conserving energy, recovery response. So obviously, as you can imagine, this is the yin and the yang of our nervous system. We need both. And in order to sustain and maintain balance and health and and mental balance, right, and regulation. So it's very optimal and important for any kind of stress response, whether that is minimal stress, whether it's chronic stress, or whether we're talking about trauma. So I'm going to X out of this. Okay, so going a little bit further into the sympathetic nervous system. Like I said, that is your fight, flight, or freeze response. Okay, and it is triggered by all kinds of other hormonal reactions in our body are going to, turn the switch on for sympathetic or turn the switch on for parasympathetic. But we can do things to balance that we actually create for ourselves. Here we are bringing the conversation back to self-care. So there are modes of self-care that we can actually use, yoga being a part of that list, to regulate our nervous system. So it is by this way and so many other ways that yoga, meditation, movement, breath, things like this, practices such as this, can actually help us regulate our nervous system. In fact, I don't remember where I heard this. I'm not going to take credit for it, but, in yoga, many people talk about, you're doing yoga to be flexible, to get more flexible, right? We hear a lot about yoga to, for stretching and becoming more mobile and stuff like that. Which is all well and good. And there's something to be said about that from the physical perspective. But I really like to talk about yoga nowadays in the way that it allows for a flexible nervous system, meaning you actually elevate your ability to maintain balance through stress because your nervous system is regulated. So that is where we get to the real nitty-gritty of how physiologically we can actually bring practices into our life, not only to manage stress on a baseline level, but to actually resolve and reverse trauma responses. And again, all scientifically proven clinical research happening right now continuously. Keep your eyes on. I'm sure after like having this conversation, you're going to start to see, or hearing this or listening to this, you're going to start to hear about things, or, Google or Facebook will listen to this and start popping articles up in front of you. So we talked about the autonomic nervous system, and for a moment, I want to talk about the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve travels from all the way up and down the spine from your brain to your gut. It's your gut brain axis, and it is the main nerve for the autonomic nervous system. Oh, excuse me, main nerve for the parasympathetic nervous system. So optimal health of the vagus nerve translates to regulation of the autonomic nervous system by creating balance so that parasympathetic response can come in when it needs to and initiate rest and digest versus fight, flight, or freeze. I always hesitate when I say those three responses because for some reason fright wants to come in every single time, and it's fight, flight, freeze. Which, by the way, for a moment, fight, obviously we know, like, just so that we're understanding what that actually means. When your body is in reaction to stress or to a traumatic event, there are those three responses, right? That's when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in to drive. And let's be clear. We need both, as I've said many times. We actually need, that sympathetic response to protect us. So many things that happen in the midst of trauma happen out of a grasping for safety and security. So we don't want to get into an area where we're now thinking, oh, there's something wrong with me because I am, too much in this space, or too, my body is reacting too much in this way. No, it's just that we need to find a way to bring in the parasympathetic response as well and create regulation. So we have fight, flight, freeze. Fight is obviously, in your protection mode, right? You're setting boundaries, you're getting physical, you are trying to protect yourself. Flight is like, I need to get the hell out of here. So I want you to kind of wrap your head around not only physically fleeing, okay, but even in your relationships that can get complicated and stressful, there is this sort of there's this sort of energetic or emotional fleeing, right? Where it's that dissociation that we talked about. That's kind of that flight. Like, I'm going to leave myself, I'm going to either leave myself and leave my body, and leave my boundaries and my concerns and my belief systems and my morals and my values over there for safety. Or I'm just going to sort of, for example, like disappearing from someone's life, removing yourself, right? Because of a traumatic response. You also have freeze. So freezing is where a lot of trauma stays with us, because you have this response where you are stuck, you are blocked, you can't really get out of that reaction. So again, at the risk of going too deep into this, I just wanted to come back to those responses. And then of course the parasympathetic, rest and recover, that is literally for the purpose of allowing space and time to recover from these experiences. So we need both. The vagus nerve, coming back to that, is, like I said, a very important player in the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's also a ton of self-care practices and therapies right now that are specifically around optimizing the health of the vagus nerve. There's also a theory called the Polyvagal Theory. You can look this up. It basically talks about how the vagus nerve it's so intelligent that it actually responds to interconnection between people. So if you see a pleasant look on my face and a smile on my face and my eyes bright and wide, and I'm listening to you and I'm vulnerable with you and I'm opening myself to you, versus a, closed off body language, furrowed eyebrows, kind of concerned and reserved look on my face. The parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve can actually react to that. So the polyvagal theory is very much about connect to co-regulate. So it's this beautiful theory that I think there's a lot of scientific and physiological research attached to it. But then the overarching message is literally the way that we co-regulate in a healthy way is to help each other, is to support each other, is to actually coexist and connect with each other. So obviously we can go into so many concepts with that, especially in the world we live in now, where things tend to be really polarizing and there's a lot of arguing within politics, within, values, within, vaccines. There's less co-regulation and connection than than maybe would be optimal given that situation. So we're going to talk more about that when it comes to trauma-informed care. So I'm going to flip into yoga, into the yoga conversation for a moment, finally bringing it back. There are many ways in which yoga can help resolve trauma. It is a beautiful practice physically, spiritually. There's a philosophical practice to yoga, all of it. We can bring it all in and it can all support mental health. But very specifically, we're talking about how yoga can help from a physiological perspective to help resolve trauma and manage stress. So, yes. So bringing together the concept of the physical practice of yoga and the polyvagal theory for a moment. So the polyvagal theory, just going back to that, do you know how when somebody's really sweet to you and then you have this sort of visceral response, whether it's a romantic relationship or just a platonic but very, somewhat close relationship, or or a relationship that you enjoy, you might have a very visceral response of like butterflies. So butterflies, I just want you for this purpose to throw the concept of butterflies in the belly being just like a romantic thing. I want you to think about it, about that sensation, and it's obviously doesn't feel exactly like butterflies in your belly, but there is a reason that we say that is because we have a sensation that's called a bottom up reaction. It's something that happens inside of us that literally starts from within us, from within our gut area, from within that autonomic nervous system area, and travels upward and then moves us into action. And then you have, so polyvagal theory takes all of this into account. You have bottom up experiences and you have top down experiences. And so if we can balance the type of experiences that we have, we can optimize the health of our vagus nerve and therefore optimize the health of the parasympathetic nervous system and have it be more able to come in and help us recover from stress and trauma. So yoga is not only a bottom up experience, but it is both a top down and bottom up experience from within the body. I mean, we hear all the time that, that repeated phrase of get out of your head and into your body. There is something to be said about that. So with the ability, with proper instruction, from yoga teachers and from your trainers, you will get very helpful guidance as to how to connect to your body again, how to remember how to actually connect to these sensations, but also just simply about body awareness. So we walk around through our lives just like in constant reaction to the external world. And we leave our bodies. We're more in this whirlwind of crazy, anxious thoughts above our heads most of the time. And, I'm comfortable sort of generalizing that because I'm pretty sure that's most people. But when we get back into our bodies, not only do we actually, come back home to ourselves in a way, but we can actually remember how to have these bottom up experiences where we're not in constant reaction to the outside world. Those are all top down experiences. Now we're able to not only have that bottom up experience when we're in the process of practicing yoga, but now that we have that more solid connection to our body and more enhanced body awareness, we take that into our day to day. And those bottom up experiences happen more and more, where you're actually able to say, like I feel some kind of way about this from in me, what am I going to do about it? Okay. So as to not go too deep into that, the bottom up experience of yoga is really important for the parasympathetic nervous system. You also have this amazing opportunity in yoga classes sometimes to do some chanting together. And when I say chanting, it could just be the mantra of Om, right? So that's, the simplest example of chanting in yoga is that and especially doing that collectively, that plays into that polyvagal theory, that collective experience. But then also you have, which again, won't go too deep into it at this point, the chanting and its resonance and vibration actually has effect on the body physiologically as well. You have chanting, you have breath. There are scientific studies that prove that certain types of breath work and certain models of breath, like 6 counts in and 6 counts out, for example, and specifically in and out through the nose, and specifically with the emphasis on the exhale. And there's a lot of different approaches you can take, but there are studies that prove that the breath will again allow for the parasympathetic nervous system to kick in. Just simple grounding and safety. So in a yoga class, in many cases, there is going to be an emphasis on not only grounding when you're in a seated position and allowing your foundation to really release down to the earth, but even in standing poses. It's always a foundation first type of experience where we need to establish and reconnect to our sense of security and our connection to the ground and to our foundation and feeling stable before we can even really fully come into any shape or pose with any aligned and comfortable feeling to it. So we are constantly emphasizing grounding, and that the purpose of that is just to allow for safety and security, that feeling of safety and security. So it kind of allows for, that's an example of actually a top-down experience in yoga, where we're actually being told to, right, like get into a certain position and then allowing that feeling or that experience to take hold from within us. So a top-down, so that you can create very intentionally this feeling of safety and security. Okay. But it does require, slowing down. And many of us, this is the last thing I'll say, many of us have had, a life full of being taught that it's go, 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 do, more, more, more. Which I talk about all the time, and we're still living in it, and we probably still live in it day to day. I know I don't want to say I'm guilty of it, because there is something to be said about taking action and moving forward. We need to do that too. But the problem is the world that we live in doesn't really allow or reward even further the concept of slowing down and making space. So I'm going to need to speed this up now. So these are the ways in which yoga helps. I'm going to come back to this. So I want to talk about the importance of a trauma-informed world. Not just, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of trauma-informed yoga, but I want to kind of span it outward, because really what's more optimally important right now is establishing a trauma-informed world. Now that we are informed about the existence of trauma and its symptoms and the subsequent diagnosis and how it manifests physiologically within the body and how we can literally get in and resolve it through the body, which there are so many therapies and practices, like I said, that are actually meant to do just that. But we have to also remember the importance of that connectedness with each other, connect to co-regulate. And if we're going to connect to co-regulate, we need to be trauma informed, not only in our yoga classes, but in our businesses, in our ventures, in our projects, in our language, and in our lives. So I'm just going to throw out some ways in which being trauma informed, ways in which we shift ourselves in big and small ways to become more trauma informed. First of all, trauma informed really means being cognizant of the span of trauma and the symptoms associated, and the high rate and prevalence of trauma responses and the subsequent mental health concerns that come with it. So it's really about just simply being cognizant and even further becoming compassionate about that. I will give you an example. In the past, addiction was very much, was very stigmatized. It still is in some ways, but very stigmatized, as known as a disease, but somehow stigmatized as like, why can't this person fix their disease? Type of thing. And the person, there was just a lot of shame and blame attached to it and guilt attached to that, to having that diagnosis or that dis-ease. And now we can take that as an example from what we know of where addiction comes from and stems from, and look at it and use it as an example of how to become cognizant about it, the origin, but also compassionate with the people who are suffering. And I know that it can seem like sort of a behemoth to shift views and shift patterns in this way, but we do this first in small ways and then in bigger ways. So we also need to be cognizant of adjusting our approach as to not trigger or even re-traumatize, whether it's your students, your coworkers, your friends, your clients, your audience, whoever it is that's on the receiving end of your language and your functioning. So even further, to take it a dip further into creating a trauma-informed world, we can actually take steps to create a sense of safety and security amongst not only special populations, but in groups, that will actually allow more of a safe and opportunistic place for them to learn and grow and evolve beyond their symptoms or diagnosis or just circumstances. So I'm just putting that out. And one of the simplest ways that we can do this is just to start opening. I know it's going to sound cliche, guys, but just to start opening up to people. Okay. And I know that it gets uncomfortable, but I want to take you back to that connect to co-regulate concept from Polyvagal Theory. Literally a smile, a raise in the eyes, eye contact. Okay. We have to be careful about physical contact because that in many cases can be re-traumatizing for the traumatized. So especially in our classes, whether it's any kind of class that you're teaching or any group of people that you're speaking to on a topic, or, even like your co-students in a class, careful about these things. Other ways that we can really create specifically trauma-informed yoga, and that you should know as somebody who's taking a yoga class, not only for teachers who are listening right now, but for someone who's a student or taking a yoga class from the other perspective too. So mudras, or for example, like, we have palm and fingertip placement that we call mudras. And the most common of which is that prayer right up at the heart space, the Anjani mudra. Mudras are extremely helpful. So incorporating things like that, plus the chanting that I was talking about into classes, offering the use of props like blocks and straps that allow a person with different varying levels of not only capabilities within their body and body shapes, but potentially taking into account the people in the class who have body image concerns and struggles, or even specific diagnosis of body dysmorphia, right? You would be surprised how many people just in your day-to-day you come in contact with that have major body image struggles, which is a whole nother bag of worms a whole other can of worms to open as to why that is, right? Poses like happy baby, for example, when your legs are open and the feet are and the hips are wide open and we're facing the ceiling and everything is open. Poses like that can be very vulnerable physically, so we avoid things like that. So if you're in a class and you're taking the class and you don't feel comfortable coming into something that the teacher is cueing, don't. But again, notice when you are triggered by anything and know that at one time that was a defense for you. It was a life raft for you. It needed to be there. It doesn't need to be there anymore because that traumatic event is not happening to you anymore. But I say this specifically because I want to unscary yoga to people. People don't realize, I went to this yoga class and it was a disaster. I hear it all the time. And it's kind of like, there was something in that really triggered you. And it could have been something sort of simpler, like everybody else in the class coming into a shoulder stand or something complicated, some kind of balance, right? That you just physically couldn't even, gather the strength to get into at that day or that time. or that phase that you were in or whatever it was. And it could be really triggering. So I'm just trying to make the point that there are ways in which we can be cognizant of these traumas that are still living within us and then move past them together as a collective. So as a supplement to this talk, I'm going to be putting together a list of ways not only to be more trauma informed in your everyday life, creating a more trauma informed world, but there will be also a list for the students and teachers listening, the yoga students and teachers listening, a list of ways that yoga can be more trauma informed. Things to incorporate, things to remove, language to use or not use, things like that. And the last thing I'm going to leave you all with is this, which I've probably paraphrased already. But, just repeating that mental illness is an epidemic right now. It's everywhere. It's in every room that you walk into. It's in every room that you walk into. There is not only mental illness, but there's trauma. Let alone the dis-ease that's stemming from all of the physiological responses of trauma. The diagnoses are continuous and building. It's our current way, right? Our current way is to diagnose and then treat or medicate, which is necessary in many cases, but just planting the seed sort of in the back of everyone's head about certain diagnosis or diseases that could very well be based on dysregulation of the nervous system from trauma response. But remembering this, that yoga and other self-care practices are here, and they are ways to regulate the nervous system. So really, if you take anything away from this, it's just like, man, I can easily get in contact with practitioners, coaches, therapists, people who can support me in these practices, in learning more about these practices to regulate my potentially dysregulated nervous system. And also to take from that you have more control over your wellness than you might have been led to believe. I'm just going to leave it at that. You have more control over your wellness than you may have been led to believe. So breathe. That's the one thing I'm going to leave you with, because yoga, obviously a big part of it, any yoga class is going to be the breath. That's the anchor. The anchor is the breath of any yoga class. So I want, we talk about yoga and everybody thinks about the physical and they think about the poses and getting into the shapes and can I get into the shape? And what if she tells me to get into a shape I can't get into? And you go down the rabbit hole. The breath is your anchor. The breath will allow you to get into that rest and digest, get into your body in a more secure and safe way so that you can feel exactly what is right and not right for you in that moment. And you can then have the knowledge of how to modify or how to make it your own and how to make it work for you. But the breath is the anchor. So I will leave you with that. Take big, expansive inhales throughout your day and take complete emptying exhales throughout your day. And be well and take care of yourself. Thank you for listening. We'll see you soon.